This is a program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Jack Goldsmith, professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law, to be specific. He's written a book recently, most recently, on the terror presidency, and there's a book coming out on Jimmy Hoffa that I heard about, and he's writing a book on the question of our topic today. He went to Washington and Lee College as an undergraduate, and then to Oxford, and then to Yale Law School. And he clerked with Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court. He's also been outside of academia. He served in the Department of Justice, where he was Assistant Attorney General, Office of Legal Counsel from October 3 to 4. And then later on in the Defense Department, the Department of Defense, he served as special counsel to the General Counsel there. And he's taught at the Chicago Law School and Virginia Law School, and is now at Harvard. So his topic today is losing the internet freedom fight. So, Jack.
Thank you very much, Harvey, for having me. Thanks for coming today. I'm at the beginning of writing a book about something related to the topic of today. And so I'm still trying to figure out what the book is about. I've got views and ideas, but I haven't formed a thesis yet. The basic thrust, and it's not at the 40,000 foot level, it's not very interesting, is that the United States is losing quite badly in both domestic and internationally in cybersecurity, in securing our digital networks. Digital networks in which all of our, or much of our, economic and military and national security and diplomatic power lies, or at least is dependent. So today I'm going to walk you through some arguments that are basically drawn from the paper that you might or might not have read. That takes one lens on what the problems are. I don't think there's much in here that's normative. I'm just trying to explain. And the lens I'm going to use is the internet freedom agenda, which has been, as I'll explain in a second, the U.S. agenda in terms of both domestically and globally for how the United States has thought about spreading its vision of the internet and how it should be regulated. Anyway, I'm going to use that as a lens to get at some of the problems we face. There are many other problems, and I'm happy to talk about anything you want on this topic. I hope this takes about 25 or 30 minutes. So, Hillary Clinton gave a speech in 2010 that was the most mature expression of the U.S. Open internet or internet freedom agenda. It didn't start with her. It actually started with her husband when he was president. But these ideas, most of them, have been articulated by the United States since 1990 as a way of thinking about what the U.S. position is on how we should think about the regulation of digital networks. And for current purposes, let's just think about that as the internet. So the United States was for the free flow of information across borders. It was against censorship. It was against blocking online services and taking down content. It was against burdensome internet IT as internet technology firm regulations. The Internet Freedom Initiative was something that Hillary Clinton started in the State Department in 2010, and the idea here is not only are we going to fight for these things at the rhetorical and diplomatic level, we're actually going to empower actors with tools abroad in authoritarian states to help them circumvent authoritarian control on their networks. So in China and Russia and nations in the Middle East, we're going to help civil society, help actors there who are fighting oppression, to try to empower them with tools to help them be anonymous when they're organizing, and to help them defeat censorship, and to help them avoid detection by the state. She said that to make all of this work, we have to have robust cybersecurity, and this was not an issue that was important in the 1990s when her husband was president, but it became very important to the United States by the 2000s because we were getting our cybersecurity was becoming a problem, primarily because we were having a lot of intellectual property theft, largely but not exclusively from the Chinese. But her general point was to have freedom on these networks, the networks have to be secure. For them to work, they have to be secure. And she proposed that the United States work hard to develop international norms, hopefully international law, to help ensconce or embody these principles. So that agenda, that vision is in tatters. It's just failed. And that's what this talk's going to be about. It's failed for three reasons. It's failed for a lot of reasons, but it's failed for three reasons I'm going to discuss. And these are the three reasons, and I'm just going to go through them. The first one I'm just going to spend one slide on. This is, if there's one thing that Americans don't understand that they need to understand about our cybersecurity predicament, and by cybersecurity predicament, that means, let me just tell you what I think that means. That means the fact that we can't protect our networks from theft or disruption, and disruption including things like the Democratic National Committee hack and the Russian disruption in the election last fall. So the entire array of theft and attack and disruption of digital networks. So the first thing and most important thing that Americans generally don't understand is that we, the United States, are seen as the great cyber bully when it comes to cyber intrusions. When Snowden revealed all that he revealed in 2013, he disclosed what people in the government knew, which is that the United States is completely inside the networks of other countries. And we're inside those networks, taking information and using it to advance our diplomatic and national security and economic, basically all of our international agenda is aided by these electronic surveillance abroad, sweeping up massive amounts of information. You can imagine other countries didn't like this very much. But it wasn't just that. It was two other things that form part of the tableau for why the United States is seen as a cyber bully, for lack of a better phrase. One was we were not just stealing information, but we were seen to be the ones that were engaged most in attacking networks. We were kind of bragging that we were very successful in attacking terrorist networks and helping to bring down terrorists. We were also, it was attributed to the United States, the Stuxnet attack in Iran in, I guess it was in 2009, 2010, around that period, started a little earlier. But this was, as General Hayden, who was the former director of the NSA and the CIA, said later, he said that Stuxnet crossed a Rubicon because it was the first time that there had been an attack by a major country on another major country that actually had physical consequences related to national security. And so we were the first to do that, and we were seen as the most aggressive. And frankly, the United States would brag about its offensive prowess in cyber. So the first thing you have to understand when we complain about things like all the terrible things the Chinese and the Russians are doing to us is nobody feels sorry for us because we're widely viewed as the biggest threat. That's background. The second point is that the openness that Clinton said she wanted to impose and that the United States has been it has been an agenda item for the United States since the 1990s to help bring freedom to networks abroad. And I think and there was hope back in the 90s, and then there was hope in the 2000s, and then there was hope in the 2010s that this agenda was making progress, but I think we're now in a position to see that this has failed. The Chinese have much more control over their networks now than they've ever had, and they're getting better by the day at it. I'm not going to go through all of these techniques, but suffice it to say that through a variety of steps that they can take inside their borders, the Chinese have extraordinary control over their networks of any type that they want to exercise. But at the same time, it has not, as everyone predicted, meant that they don't have a robust and very vibrant internet. They do. If anyone's ever been on the internet in China, you see that there's a lot going on there, and it has been key to their economic success, and they have found ways to use digital networks to help bring economic success and also to have a robust social space while at the same time doing an extraordinarily good job, effective I should say, job of maintaining the party's control and keeping out the kinds of speech and organization they want to keep out. And they basically have done this by all sorts of intermediary strategies, going after people and by going after institutions and networks and infrastructure and people inside their territory they can achieve very effective control, and they have. And it's not just the Chinese. During the Arab Spring, early in the Arab Spring, there was a lot of hope that in those few months or maybe the year in which it looked like there might be a real revolution spreading around the Middle East, and it seemed that the organizations and the protests seemed to be enabled by social media. A lot of people at the time said, don't place too much faith in social media. It wasn't as consequential as you think, and it can be turned against those protesters. And in fact, that's what's happened. Basically, the state, what seemed like a change in technology that empowered the people against the state was really just the state being ignorant and not on top of the situation. Since the last 3 or 4 years, they have gotten on top of the situation. And they are regulating social media very, very heavily, and they're keeping out when they want, and they're using it, they're reverse engineering it to use it to monitor the people who are organizing and protesting. So as Ron Deibert says, and I think this is accurate, authoritarian regimes have proven themselves surprisingly and dismayingly light-footed and adaptable at controlling internet and social media and using these tools for their authoritarian ends. That's not the only thing. Tanks have been involved also. I don't want to say that it's all about social media one way or the other, but social media is not the threat, or at least it's a controllable threat, it seems. This is a Freedom House study from 2016. They just came out with another one, but I haven't studied it yet, about a week ago, but the results are basically the same. And they basically show that the yellow and the purple are places where there aren't what we would call freedom on the internet, especially the purple. And as the study shows, for the 6th year in a row these are soft variables that they use to study whether freedom has grown or declined, but by their numbers, and that's a pretty good test, freedom has been declining. States are getting more and more in the business of regulating intermediaries to control speech and political activity on the network. So that's what authoritarian states have been doing, and that's how they've been doing it to defeat our vision of the way the internet should work. The Europeans who have, of course, a different vision, closer to ours, but nonetheless quite different, have been imposing their vision on the network. And that vision is a vision that has a very different understanding of the relationship between the state and the individual. It's in some ways the opposite of ours. They value privacy, individual privacy. They value consumer protection and consumer control over their own information much more than they do free speech and digital trade, which is what we tend to value more. They have a much more robust conception of regulation. They're much more inclined to regulate these firms, and they're much more suspicious of government electronic surveillance than we are, primarily because, well, for a lot of reasons, and they especially don't like it when they think the United States is surveilling them heavily, which it does. That's why they were really angry by the Snowden stuff. So they've been in the business, and you read about this in the New York Times once every couple of weeks, of really regulating the hell out of our internet technology firms there in all of these dimensions. I don't think these are existential threats to these firms. These firms are extremely wealthy, and they're making a lot of money in Europe. The only point is that Europe has been able to impose its vision of the network within its borders, and it's not our internet freedom vision. And they do so through the same means that the Chinese and the Russians and the Saudis do, which is they control physical networks in their countries and people in their countries. And through those threats and through coercion, they can achieve the type of internet they want. To give you one example, you've heard of the right to be forgotten. This is basically the idea that if certain types of information that someone doesn't want on the internet, they can petition internet platforms and make them take it off the internet. And there's a case right now in the European Court of Justice that's going to ask the question whether not only does Google have to take something off the network that can be seen in France on google.fr, but they also have to take it off the Google network globally. So there's a chance that that the right to be forgotten will be imposed globally. And in other words, the people in the United States won't be able to see that information either. How can that happen? It happens because it all happens through a private company. And Google does business globally, and Google's going to make a decision. Do we want to keep doing business in Europe and accept this penalty of having to take this data off our networks, including off the United States networks, or do we want to pull out of Europe? I contend that's going to be an easy choice for Google. So Europe has extraordinary market power, and they can impose the types of regulations they want. So whether it's in other Western countries or whether it's in authoritarian countries, we have not achieved the, and all of this is inconsistent with the U.S. Internet agenda. In addition to controlling networks the way they want in their territories, they also have exported digital control. The United States is on both ends of this. Our companies export digital freedom tools and anonymizing tools and circumvention tools and the like. That's the Internet freedom agenda. We also have firms that help countries oppress their people, help them surveil and find their people. So we're on both sides of the digital export. The authoritarian countries, China is selling its really robust and sophisticated know-how to all sorts of authoritarian states. It has an interest in spreading these norms and in spreading the technology that underlies these norms. Europe is exporting these norms through the mechanism I just said, not by through by selling technology, but just by regulating in Europe, and has extraterritorial or effects outside of Europe. This is true of the right to be forgotten, as I just described. It's true of the privacy regulations in Europe, which are basically de facto imposed on the United States because U.S. companies want to comply with the more restrictive European regulation. This gets a little bit technical, but I'll just say a sentence about this. When there's a debate in this country about whether the government should be able to have access to data in Apple phones or in Apple databases or in Facebook or in Google that's encrypted, and whether the company should be forced to either have some kind of a backdoor to allow the government to see what it wants to see with a warrant, or some technique to get access to this information. And right now, the answer is no. The government is not, the federal government has, the executive branch wants this, the Congress hasn't given it to it, and the courts haven't yet either. This will change when the Europeans are ahead of us on this, and when Google and Facebook create backdoors or something equivalent, technical access to their networks despite encryption in Europe, the arguments for not doing so here will go away. And so that norm will come across the Atlantic. So that is the story about why we're failing abroad. Now I want to talk about why the Internet freedom agenda is failing at home. And the basic idea here is we have this, we in the United States have had this what I think of as very naive conception of speech on the network is it's just a good thing on balance. The more speech, the better, and the less regulation, the better. And this is proving, this is not an argument for more regulation. I'm just describing what's happened because I think it's a very difficult problem and I don't have great solutions. But this is proven to be a naive assumption. And I'm going to talk about two contexts in particular where openness has serious problems at home, and these will both be familiar examples. So it is impossible to exaggerate how much U.S. networks are under assault. These are just examples that I just pulled at random out of the last basically 13 months. Hardly a week goes by when there's not some amazing revelation about some amazing breach of either public, government, or private networks. And sometimes it's just private data, which can be used for other purposes. Sometimes it's not on this list are the either tens or hundreds of billions, depending on who you believe, of intellectual property that's been stolen from the United States over the last decade. And our networks are under assault. They're literally under assault. And most of it is theft, taking things out and either publishing them or using them. But increasingly, it is attack. It is disrupting things as well. And this is Rob Joyce, who's the Trump's cyber czar, the president's cyber czar, who is the head of basically the Tailored Access Operations branch of the National Security Agency. This was the person who was very in charge of our most sophisticated offensive cyber exploitation initiatives. He now is the cyber czar in the White House, and this is what he said last month, maybe it was 2 months ago, about we're just watching these breaches every day and we're not doing anything about it. We're literally doing barely anything about it, and I'm going to talk about why that is. So there are a lot of reasons why we're not securing our networks. And I'm happy to talk about all of them after my talk if you want to. But just a few here. the one I want to focus on is how, because the theme of this slides and this presentation is openness and how openness hurts us. This is a quote from President Obama, who's explaining why he hesitated last fall, why he hesitated to strike back at the Russians. And the basic answer was, our society is more open and more digitalized, and we have more to lose from getting in an escalatory conflict with the Soviets. And that logic, and this is what, that basic logic is what, this is the former Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper. He's talking about the same basic logic that prevented us from responding to Iranian attacks on U.S. banks in 2012. And the logic is that we fear that someone does something bad to us, we don't respond, we don't either in a retaliation or to try to establish deterrence, because we feel like our response will lead to a counter response that will be worse for us. Now, in a military situation or in any kind of diplomatic situation, that's a terrible situation to be in. Terrible situation to be in. That is precisely the situation we've been in for a while now. When you hear Clapper say things like, we currently cannot put a lot of stock in cyber deterrence, it's hard to create the substance and psychology of deterrence. The primary reason is we have not been able to figure out how we can bring pain in response to what's happening to us. I'll talk about this a little bit more in a second. We have not been able to figure out how we can bring pain in response to what's happening to us without the possibility of worse things happening to us in response to whatever pain we bring. So earlier this week, I just wrote about this. President Obama reached this deal with the president of China in 2015 saying no more theft. After tens or hundreds of billions of dollars of theft, the agreement was no more theft. No more theft by China, by the state, knowingly, of U.S. intellectual property for commercial purposes. That was essentially the agreement. On Monday, there was an indictment of a Chinese firm that had basically been doing just that. Now, this indictment shows two things. One, the deal's not working. It's not working for a lot of reasons. I'm happy to talk about that. But two, an indictment is the response we gave to this breach of this. And these are an indictment that is never going to come to fruition. The defendants are never going to appear in the United States. So this is no penalty at all. But this is the most we can muster. Now, we probably are doing things covertly. Everybody I've talked to in the government says it's not much, it's not enough. And most importantly, when you respond in secret, you don't create the psychology of deterrence because third parties don't know about it. Also in the news is we're seeing more and more, and this is a really serious problem, a very hard problem, and I don't have great solutions, and everybody's thinking about this, is that increasingly we're understanding that the open internet empowers weaponized speech. That's a term of art. Let me tell you what I mean. It makes it easier to engage in disinformation campaigns, i.e. propaganda, or the creation and use of fake news or misinformation. These are all related concepts. It does so because speech is very easy to produce and very easy to disseminate. And counter speech in the private realm is very easy to produce and very easy to disseminate on a huge scale. So we've seen things like the DNC hack, which is nothing more than stealing some information from someone's account and publishing it. As President Obama said at his last press conference, it was a very simple it was just a very simple operation. It wasn't very sophisticated, not very hard to do. Enormous consequences because of the way the networks spread the news. It's also because so let me just go through the list. Also targeted vicious group attacks, troll armies. Someone says something, and our normal model of speech is that everyone can speak and everyone will have a marketplace of ideas, and the best ideas will bubble up and come out. And what's happening is the market is not functioning well because we have these asymmetries of power in the market that get together and drown out speech, truthful speech with false speech, or valid speech with attacks on character and reputation that are not by one person but by thousands or hundreds of thousands, often empowered by bots. Flooding tactics are tactics that distort or overcome disfavored speech through fake news, fake commentators, and bots of various sorts. This is all happening. There's a lot of reasons why this is happening, in part because of these networks, in part because the production of speech is so cheap. Also happening at the same time, of course, is that our society, for a variety of reasons, is becoming, what's the right word? More splintered, I'll just say. That, and they're becoming more splintered because media sources are more splintered, and we are tending, I believe, and this is not unique to me, to live in our, people in our country tend to live more and more in their own informational bubbles, and to talk less and less, and to be less empathetic towards and less interested in understanding other groups that are not in those in their bubbles. This is empowered. This is exacerbated by our politics. The cause and effect is hard to figure out here, but the point is, whatever the cause of this is exacerbating all of these factors. So, just 2 more slides, and then we can have a conversation. So I just want to, this is a little bit of summary, but I just want to point out that this is a big picture point that I'm going to make more of in the book, and it's a little bit orthogonal to this talk, but it's really the case that, the internet kind of, as I think I said in one of the first few paragraphs of that paper, it kind of, at first it was thought to kind of, in its code, embody American values. Open, free, hard to censor, non-regulated. And for the first 10 or 15 or 20 years of the commercialized internet, everything's been going great, right? These enormous wealth generated by American companies that spread around the world, all of the enormous benefits we've gotten from the network. We're starting to see that in many ways these technologies harm the United States in an asymmetric way. Just one background point that's not on here. When you have a computer that's connected to the internet, that means that the number of adversaries who can do bad things to the value on that computer, it used to be that you had to get access to the physical thing to steal it or disrupt it or send a projectile or something in there to disrupt it, which is hard to do. If it's connected to the internet, it's connected to billions of people, in theory. So the number of adverse actors goes up a lot. And so that's the background point. So these are just some asymmetries. I've already talked about this first one. Because we're so dependent and we're on these networks, we're much more vulnerable from a cyber operation than the North Koreans. That's the other extreme. They have practically no internet. So it's very hard to do things painful to them on their internet. We're the other extreme. The attack surfaces are infinite. Who would have thought that stealing those emails would cause the disruption it has in this country? And there are an infinite number of targets and an infinite number of offensive pathways like that. We're asymmetrically exposed to IP theft because we are large producers of intellectual property, and we don't steal. Our government has a policy for a variety of reasons of not stealing foreign intellectual property, unlike the Chinese. And moreover, there's not a lot of intellectual property in China we're interested in stealing. We're asymmetrically vulnerable there. We're asymmetrically exposed to foreign information operations like the DNC hack precisely because of our openness. We couldn't do the same thing to the Russians because they control the media more, they have much more control over speech, and their elections are more controlled, to put it mildly. We're also asymmetrically constrained by law. There are many reasons. I'm happy to talk about them. I haven't figured them all out yet, even after talking to a lot of people in the government who worry about this. There are a lot of reasons why we are asymmetrically constrained in responding. I've given some of them, but one I want to mention is we take legal constraints much, much more seriously than our adversaries. So there are a lot of things that we just won't do, including a lot of things that I think are stupid that we don't do, but that our lawyers and our government take certain legal constraints very, very seriously. That's another reason why we're asymmetrically constrained in this area. So this is just as an example. So that kind of captures everything I've been saying. Hillary Clinton's speech in 2010 was basically directed at Putin and China. She basically said, we have a different vision than you about the internet and about your networks, and we're going to empower actors to go in your networks and help bring freedom to them. And in 2011, there were protests, you may remember, in December of 2011. I think it's December 2011, over the legislative elections in the December of 2011. And Putin, it was a point where Putin, it was thought that his regime may be in jeopardy, at least a little bit. He was furious about this, and at the time he blamed Hillary Clinton overtly. And he said, she's stirring up problems. He basically identified the internet freedom agenda. He basically said there's a covert action against us. I wasn't in the government then, but it wouldn't have surprised me if that were true. The United States, we are, just as a little side point, we are very upset that someone has interfered in our election. No country in the post-World War II era has been nearly as aggressive as the United States in interfering in foreign elections, including through digital means. And Putin saw this, and just like the Chinese do, as our internet freedom agenda attacking their networks is very much an attack on their sovereignty and very much a threat to their regime, exactly the way we see what happened in our election. I'm not saying one is more, there are obviously moral differences. We can talk about that as well. But the point is, it might be that the 2006 DNC hack was a response to this 2011 point. And the point is that Hillary Clinton was saying, we're going to bring freedom to Russia, and exactly the opposite happened. We weren't able to bring freedom to Russia, but Russia was able to exploit our freedom to do enormous damage to our country. And that, in a nutshell, captures what I'm trying to say. These are predictions. I think that this is going to get very bad, and that all the things I described, I don't see any stopping point anytime soon. I don't know anyone who does. And so these are just 5 predictions, and then we can talk about whatever you like. Our firms will muddle through. They'll fight with all of their money and political tools to try to clamp down on the foreign regulations in Europe. Facebook is desperate to get into China, and if it gets into China, it will go in on China's terms, period. And that would mean censorship, and that would mean retention of data, and that would mean compliance with all of the very robust requirements it takes to do business in China. And if it doesn't want to do business there, like a U.S. company, if U.S. companies don't want to comply with those restrictions, they just won't do business there, and they'll make those on the basis of business decisions. In Europe, they will pay the enormous fines and continue to make a lot of money, just not as much. I think that basically the internet freedom agenda that Hillary Clinton outlined has stopped under Donald Trump. I don't think it's going to get going very robustly after Trump, because I think that the hypocrisy in that agenda and the harm that it reciprocally brings to us people are becoming more aware of that. To the extent that I'm right about our aggressive, offensive cyber actions abroad, inviting the types of things that are happening to us, and to the extent that we are asymmetrically vulnerable, I think that there will be attempts by the United States to try to reach cooperative arrangements with countries about getting relief from what they're doing in our networks in exchange for us having some restraint. Happy to talk about what that means and what the hurdles are. We're already rethinking openness at home in terms of the big internet firms, Facebook, Twitter, and Google. Had 3 hearings in the last 2 weeks before a very angry Congress, and they're very much in the business now of rethinking their approach to speech. Under the threat of government regulation, it's not clear what the First Amendment allows the government to do overtly to these firms, but the threat is enough, and these firms are already changing. On hate speech front, on bullying speech, on terrorist speech or violence, on propaganda, on certain forms of ideological speech, we're going to be rethinking speech and its relationship to openness at home. And finally, I predict when this problem gets badly enough, our concerns now about the government being in the network and our concerns about privacy and the like will seem quaint. Because when things get really bad and when these networks that we're so dependent upon fail, as they're going to continue to do, and as we continue to suffer harm, there will be a demand for the government to do something about it. Now, a lot of what the government should be doing about this is, and I was at the University of Chicago for 6 years, and my heart and soul are still there. So I say this with some trepidation. We need more regulation, and I'm happy to talk about that. Because a lot of our cybersecurity problems are caused by the fact that firms that are not keeping our data secure are suffering no legal penalty. So they're generating what economists call negative externalities, and they're not pricing them. And one big solution is going to be a lot more regulation. There are costs to that in terms of innovation and the price of these products, but we don't have the balance right. But another hard trade-off is that the government's going to be more directly in the network. Just as the government controls space and air and sea to prevent those channels of attack from bringing us harm, they will be in our networks. I don't know if it'll be 5 years or 10 years, but I'm confident that they will. And that's all I have to say.
All right, wow, so, questions?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm struck by whatever unwritten rule there is that says that an internet attack can only be countered with an internet attack. I mean, in a way, if a country didn't have electricity and I threatened to cut off their electricity, I wouldn't be harming them at all, as you said.
Yep.
But why wouldn't then I try to kind of cut off their candles?
Yep.
And
So there's no such rule, and in fact, the doctrine is the opposite. Our doctrine is explicitly that we reserve the right to respond to an internet attack with any means. That doesn't solve the problem, because let's say instead of attacking Putin with some cyber weapon, we dropped a bomb on Moscow.
well, that would be very extreme. But I was thinking more along the lines of, you kick Russia out of the SWIFT code system. They can no longer deal in dollars. That's pretty
Okay.
painful, and it's not nuclear.
Yeah, no, I agree. We could bring all sorts of pain to any country that does harm to us. The question is, when we do that, and this is why the domain in which we attack them doesn't matter, if we're vulnerable on the cyber front to retaliation, and if we're going to suffer more, so let's say we kick them out of SWIFT, that would be very damaging to them. And let's say in response they just bring down the New York Stock Exchange. That wouldn't be good. That's the escalation problem. I'm not saying that would happen. I'm saying this is not me speculating. I know this is what the government officials worry about. So it's not about, we have plenty of tools, cyber and non-cyber, to retaliate. But whereas we think we can protect the blowback in kinetic space, we can't protect the blowback response in cyberspace. And that's where the weakness lies. Does that make sense?
It does. I mean, obviously, I think the point I was trying to make, I think, more broadly, and I think you address is, I mean, at the end of the day, it all hinges on having a relatively kind of fickle constitution to accepting any form of attack, right?
By constitution, do you mean constitution in the sense of constitutional government, or you mean stomach?
As in, the stomach.
Yeah.
Stomach, right? Yeah.
So, one of the great puzzles, and I'm trying to understand this and figure this out and write about it, is why government officials can't even explain this to me really, why they've hesitated so much. What they're so afraid of the attack on our networks that argument always wins the day. In part it's that, in part it's because I think that the psychology of cyber harms is different than the psychology of physical harms. If China was doing to us in physical space and coming in buildings and ripping out hardware and taking it back to China, there would be World War III. In fact, they wouldn't be doing it. The fact they're doing it invisibly makes it harder to respond to because people can't see it happening, and it's very hard to justify and prove. And something about that psychology, that psychological combination, makes it hard for us to respond, I think. There are a whole bunch of things that are tying our hands. I just mentioned some of them. And it's killing us. It's killing us. So you might be right. The fact, and a lot of people in the government think, in fact, when the Clapper quote that I gave, he argued for a more aggressive response, and he said that he was basically the Commerce Department and the Treasury Department won that debate because they were worried about our banks and our financial markets. You may be right that we could in fact absorb more, but our government is afraid to take that risk, and we just don't understand the trade-offs well enough, I don't think. Yes, sir.
Sounds like you've set up sort of an ultimate blackmail scenario. Don't respond to us because otherwise we'll attack. And you know you're vulnerable. But if the vulnerability is there, then it's only a matter of time before some of these aggressive bad actors who don't have any interest in promoting any advantages or hegemony of the United States, it's only a matter of time before they would use that lever. I mean, you're positing that they won't use it as long as we don't. But if they have the blackmail potential, who's to say when they choose, or if not this leadership of the current regime, the next regime chooses to use it for something else? So it seems to me at some point either we have to come up with a lot better defense,
Which
or,
is not feasible.
right, and that's the danger, or we're living in a world where, when I read your paper, the sense I had was that Orwell had slightly missed the point because he didn't see the internet, but the internet is the ultimate big brother, and that freedom is going to be the casualty here almost no matter what.
I believe that to be true. Freedom as we currently understand it, I mean, that's going way down the line. But just a couple of things. I'm not sure I understood all of your comments, but so on the last point, I think that our conceptions of privacy currently and our notions that there are certain things that won't be seen, won't be examined by the government are going to have to go. And that's Orwell, I think. Whether the government will use it for controlling ends or not, and whether we can find a means to keep them from doing that, that's a tough question. I'm a little bit more optimistic about that. On the first point, if I understand it, we're inside their networks, and we could do all sorts of damage at any point we wanted. And at least the large countries, I know China and Russia, are inside our networks with logic bombs, as they're called, and all sorts of things that could be triggered to do damage. This is just a piece of reality that people in the government know about, and it's not a secret. And if your point is that could be used much more aggressively against us, yes, it could. I think what's going on now is that countries are probing how far they can get before we actually do feel threatened enough to strike back. And I think ultimately people think that we're in some sort of weird mutually assured destruction situation, at least with the big countries. The danger is, and I think you were hinting at this, if more nihilistic actors that aren't in interdependence with us in some way, like the Chinese clearly are, and just have an interest in bringing us down and causing harm, those are the ones that we should be very worried about, because they're not really, there's no logic of, I mean, mutually assured destruction is a form of cooperation. There's no logic of cooperation at all. It's just they want to do us harm, period, and they don't care about the consequences. Those are the actors we need to worry most about. Fortunately, those the actors tend to have less sophisticated tools, but that's changing. It's been changing for a while. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, but it's also a pretty pessimistic outlook.
Sorry.
I figured I'd come here after reading the paper and hear a little bit of optimism and one.
I'm much more pessimistic than that paper. That was an attempt to be optimistic. Yes, sir. Go ahead.
If you could recommend, let's say, 2 or 3 most important things that might help our situation, even though it doesn't fundamentally alleviate the problem,
Right.
what would you recommend?
The first thing that everybody thinks should be done is there's a general consensus among people that in the government, and I'm going to tell you what the government thinks, and I'm kind of with them on this, is that we need to give software companies and platforms and firms like Equifax, give them more of an incentive to invest more in defense to defend their networks better. And the way you do that is there are a whole suite of regulatory tools. Liability, regulation, standards, safe harbors. There are a whole bunch of tools to get companies to take care more, to have to create secure networks. The problem is there's a cost side to that. And the cost side is on innovation and the speed of innovation and the cost of these products. And for 20 years, that argument about speed and innovation and wealth generation has been winning. And so we've been, in a way, reaping all the benefits of this innovation and pushing all the costs of cyber and security down the road. And now we're at the point when we're starting very slowly to do more, very slowly. And I don't know where the right balance is in terms of those costs. I'm just very confident that we don't have that, that we're under-regulating in terms of these firms generating these enormous externalities because they're taking inadequate precautions, because when it's not clear Equifax is going to suffer much from this massive loss of a lot of people's personal credit information under the current regime. And so if that's the case, the next Equifax is just not going to have an incentive to take more robust steps. So I think there's general agreement that we need to do more of that. How to do it is hard to figure out. It's very controversial. The West Coast hates it. I mean, they want to be left alone. I've never seen firm government animosity the way I've seen in the IT context. They really want to be left alone for understandable reasons. I think that's one thing. I think that we have to. That's the main thing, but that's not a full answer. We're going to have to adjust. So the second thing is that we're going to have to do something, take the risk of the type I was talking about, to be more aggressive, to create disincentives for some of the more aggressive and harmful attacks by foreign actors. There's a kind of a growing consensus for that in the government, but it's controversial, and everyone worries about this escalation problem. But there is a growing consensus of the people I talk to in the government that we need to take more risk. We need to be able to, because it's not clear what the retaliation will look like. There's just a lot of uncertainty about it. So the second thing to do is to try to create a bit more of a deterrence. That's very hard to do also. Those are the two things that I would focus on. There aren't a lot of great solutions. I mean, a lot of people have been thinking about this for a long time. There are not a lot of great solutions. We just can't, and we're about to go to the Internet of Things, where everything is going to have a sensor on it and a chip and connected to the Internet. Everything. Food, clothes, every gadget, every door, this, everything. And that's going to exacerbate the problem enormously. Because it's just going to create more dependence and more vulnerability. And we are not thinking, hardly at all are we thinking about security of the Internet of Things. So I think it's going to get a lot worse before it gets better. Sorry, I don't have any great solutions. Yeah.
Just trying to think of a previous historical strategic problems.
Mm-hmm.
During the Cold War, there was, among other problems, there was a difficulty in the West, the United States securing the Persian Gulf for the conventional support, and also Western Europe was vulnerable to attack. So there was nuclear deterrence, but eventually there was a shift in the late 70s, early 80s to the Strategic Defense Initiative.
Right.
And it seems that all the debates over détente versus some kind of more muscular and aggressive Reaganite policy have to be focused on the fact that Reagan was able, through these new technologies, to change the options the United States has to outspend their adversaries. I mean,
Right.
A lot of what you're talking about now, I mean, you presume progress in general powers of non-state actors, state actors. But what about the United States? I mean, can't it spend $1 trillion and a half dollars and start competing against the Chinese? And I don't know much about this area, except I have been told by people who do that we're being killed in it, quantum computing and other power computing. Because we're not, I mean, you're sort of describing a kind of static technological landscape, whereas the Cold War seems to have been won by the United States because they completely shifted the paradigm there.
Right. So I'm definitely not the person to predict technological innovation in this space. Sure, there can be, in theory, some technological innovation. I mean, it's not clear who's doing better, the U.S. or China, in quantum computing. But we're heavily invested in that for a lot of reasons. That's a hope. What's happened, what I'm describing is a technological innovation that has really been to our disadvantage structurally for all the reasons I explained. And there are a lot more reasons that I didn't explain. And yes, there could be technological change that could change that. I don't know what the silver bullet is. People talk about changing the network entirely, just rebuilding another internet. That is hugely expensive and difficult and wouldn't necessarily solve the problems. You could build a more secure network, for example. We could do what China does. By the way, China has cybersecurity problems, but fewer cybersecurity problems. And this gets back to where we're going. But how do they do it? They don't allow anonymity. They make every individual have an authenticated real identity, which is hard to break, that allows them to monitor more. They have much more of government control of the networks. They have control of the pipes at the outside. They have social credit scores for individuals for how they behave online, and they don't let you go online if you don't behave well. We could take a lot of steps. You're not talking about that, but we could take, these are steps that we could take that would improve our cybersecurity that I don't think as a society we're prepared to take yet. Sure, I mean, the Cold War deterrence theorists in the 60s didn't anticipate SDI. I don't think. There could be a technological change, but I haven't heard anyone talking about what that might be, so I don't know. Yeah.
Very much a follow-up to Rory's question. something like the Manhattan Project, is there anything that you can envision along those lines where we're getting the finest minds in these areas? I worry you're right about the need for the externalities to be paid for. My concern about going too far in that direction is if we actually harm the incentives for creating the finest technology
Completely agree.
in the world.
I completely agree.
So is there a way that at the central government level we could invest in a way that any of these ideas you're talking about, whether it's an alternative network or better methods of protecting the networks we have or our ability to respond?
So-
what about that?
So if I can just guarantee you're going to be disappointed in my answers to these types of questions. Here's all I can say. The government is obviously doing this. DARPA is doing this. Private industry is doing this. There's a huge reward for the person that can figure this problem out, right? There are lots of cybersecurity firms that are flourishing with terrible products. There's a huge demand for fixing this problem, and the government's spending a lot of money on it in all sorts of realms. And again, I want to emphasize I'm talking now on stuff I'm not expert about. My sense is that the Manhattan Project was designed to do one thing, basically. This is not a one-thing problem. It's a many, 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 many thing problem. And there are giant costs of doing anything in terms of innovation and in terms of wealth generation, frankly, and in terms of having fun toys that we play with all the time and all of the benefit, supposedly, that they bring to our lives. So it's just, my sense is, and again, this is not something I feel confident that I know enough about. My sense is that I know that there are a lot of efforts trying to fix various parts of this problem. I know there are people who are trying to internalize externalities. They're trying to figure out ways to do that won't destroy innovation. There's no great solution to that yet. And the way innovation works is you don't see something coming and then it happens. It's often not predictable. But I'm just saying right now, it's not one problem, it's many, many problems, and it's very hard for the government to achieve any of these solutions. So I'm not optimistic. With that, let me just say, the answer to the last two questions, this is not informed pessimism. My pessimism is not as informed here as it is, I think, in other respects. I just don't know. That's my basic sense. Yes, sir.
Is there any activity under the UN umbrella to address this issue?
Yes. There was something called the GGE, Group of Government Experts, that met for 15 years to try to create cyber norms, international norms that would help protect networks. It was, in my opinion, fated to fail from the beginning because China and Russia have fundamentally different conceptions of what cybersecurity is and what it means. We think cyber, and so basically the whole thing failed last summer. It just fell apart. And so the answer right now is no. There are all sorts. The UN is doing lots of things, but the main 15-year, maybe 12-year. I used to have a couple slides on this, on how the international efforts have failed. It fell apart last summer, the attempt to create cyber norms to bring relief in this. And I think that international law solutions, it's just very hard for countries to agree on, especially for antagonistic countries to agree on what the norms are. I think we might be able to have bilateral understandings about we won't do really horrible things to you of the following sort if you don't do really horrible things to us. I think that's possible, but a global regime is very hard to achieve and has failed so far. Anna.
You had offered to explain more about the legal constraints and your seeing some of
Yeah, so we have, has anyone worked, any lawyers worked in the U.S. government? I mean, I have. So, for example, to do anything in another country involving their networks, you have to go through a lot of legal hoops. You have to go through, there are strict demands for legality, And the problem is that there are at least two pervasive problems in this space that I can talk about that we get hung up on. One is, and by the way, we use these tools aggressively, but one hears that people constantly complaining that we're not using them aggressively enough, our cyber tools. So one is that we worry about sending a piece of code that may have a piece of malware that may seep into a network, say in Iran. We worry about sending that through other networks in neutral countries because that violates neutrality, it violates their sovereignty and the like. There's a big debate about this inside and outside the government, whether it really is a violation of sovereignty to send this stuff across a network in another country. Obviously, you worry about that more if it could do damage as it's traversing the country. So that's one cluster of problems that we worry about. Another cluster of problems we worry about are so-called proportionality, and that is when we do something. So I'll give you an example that I learned about in the newspaper. In the run-up to the attacks in Iraq in 2003, the fall of 2003, the Iraq War, there was a proposal on the table to take down Saddam Hussein's and his family's bank accounts, basically, just to wipe those accounts out. And according to the New York Times, that was on the table, and they decided not to do it because they couldn't be sure that it wouldn't have disruptive effects on banks in Europe or something like that. And so the effects are, so our weapons, our kinetic weapons, we have extraordinary precision with them, and we have computer algorithms that can tell you where this bullet or where this missile is going to go and whether you go at this angle or that angle to cause minimal damage and the like. We are hypersensitive about collateral damage and proportionality of effects. We just can't do that with cyber often as much. Stuxnet got out in the wild and caused damage. And so that's a second set of legal concerns that the lawyers are constantly using and there are others, but those are two typical ones. And other countries just don't worry about this as much. The Brits do, the common law countries do, but other countries just don't worry about this much, and especially authoritarian countries. Yeah.
But they're both related. Both those examples are related to the relationship between the U.S. and its allies. Say, you send it to European countries. What if they find out? What if there could be potential damage there? What are the repercussions on European banks? That's not simply legalism. That's saying, it could have consequences that are detrimental for our...
The first one is less about, I agree. So, but, we accept certain consequences and some we don't. And you're absolutely right. The second example is not just a legal concern, it's a political concern or a diplomatic concern. The first one, there have been reported cases where there's not much danger of the malware doing harm. We're just not going to send it across that network because some lawyers got some conception of neutrality that and won't allow it. And not just some lawyer; it's a high-level lawyer. There are other examples, but it's stuff like that. UN Charter stuff that we take more seriously than other nations. Yes.
In light of the fact that we have, as you mentioned, the IoT, we have our vulnerabilities to the smart grid, we have upcoming driverless cars, autonomous vehicles, so more things are going to be computerized. I'm just concerned about, in the United States, the number of people who are educated or trained in terms of cybersecurity, and I don't know what you know about the programs that exist already, or where, a lot of places there are people who may not have a 4-year degree but maybe sort of ramped up and be able to help, some in the government, some in the private sector.
I don't know the answer to this. I know that, the fastest growing majors at all of the Ivy League schools in Stanford, MIT, are related to computer science.
Yes, I know.
I know.
Yeah,
but I know you're talking about cybersecurity. Yeah.
Cybersecurity.
No, I understand. I was building up to that. I don't know the answer to the question. I know that there's a huge demand for cybersecurity experts.
Yes.
And usually when there's a demand like that and it's being paid for, the supply will rise, obviously, and I know this is happening. One sees more cybersecurity firms, one sees more cybersecurity majors, one sees more cybersecurity training sessions. I just don't know the rate or whether it's sufficient. I just have no idea.
So I might be able to toss something in on that because I teach information. some information security courses at BU Met. We have a hell of a time trying to recruit anybody with a master's degree. And some of the people with the highest technical
Students or
competence-
teachers?
Teachers.
Uh-huh.
Some of the people with the highest technical competency do not have anything more than a bachelor's degree. Some of them not even that. They've been working in it for 30 or 35 or 40 years. Totally brilliant people, and they don't have the table stakes to teach. So
So the problem is on the teaching side.
it really is.
What about the student demand side?
There's a good student demand. So the teaching side is weak. Also, it's a little middling on academic style materials.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Yes, I do.
Tend to be pretty technical.
Excuse me, can I ask, could they get a CLE, like credit for learning the life experience? Like some people in the military towards an associate's, I mean, I'm just
That
saying in terms of
I
ramping up
can't-
because it's such a big problem.
I think that would be a great idea.
Okay, all right, I'm just curious about it. Because I know Governor Baker is very interested in partnering with a lot of things to give people an
Yeah. I
opportunity
mean, if you
to
have
get
brilliant
credit.
people whose minds are
Yeah.
top notch, but they're all
That's
busy
like a-
as anything too.
Yeah, but that's like a gatekeeping thing. If
It
they're
is- it
brilliant,
is.
then you should get them on board.
Yeah,
I'm
but
just-
but
okay,
they are
just-
busier than one-armed paper hangers.
Yeah, okay.
Yes, sir.
Could you relate your talk to what we've all been reading in the newspapers in the last week or so about net neutrality and is it the FEC Chairman Pai's decision to do away with it?
Not really. Look, the net neutrality. I know about net neutrality. I'm not the world's expert on it. Net neutrality has become a label that means a lot of things these days, and basically this move is to regulate telecommunication providers less. I don't know how it relates. I don't think there's any direct connection. It is a move against regulation, not for regulation. I mean, to the extent that's the zeitgeist, that's moving in the wrong direction, but this is really not a cybersecurity issue. It's about priority and paying for priority speed on the network primarily, and for paying for access on the network. So there must be a connection to cybersecurity, but I don't know what it is. Sorry.
Follow that up.
Yeah.
I mean, I sense that the strong tenor of your presentation is that we're going to need more regulation of the infrastructure of the internet, right? We're going to need them to be in a position to build up their capabilities. Well, it would seem to me that now would be precisely the time to de-emphasize other regulatory burdens on the infrastructure so they can bear these more critical regulatory burdens of security.
Again, I really want to emphasize, I have views about this, and I think I share your views that this is not a very useful set of regulations because the market will take care of the problems to the extent there are problems. But you're basically positing, if we're going to have regulation in this area where it's really important, let's ease the regulatory burden there. Maybe. I just actually don't know what the relationship between those two things is, but maybe. Yes, sir.
Can you please expand on the difference in terms of approach between European countries or the EU and the United States? So you mentioned the fact that some measures like the protection of privacy, the attempt to protect the right to be forgotten, aren't seen as positive here in the US.
I didn't want to go that far because I didn't. But I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So my question is whether the reason why this has happened, if this has happened, is are mainly economic reasons or legal reasons related to the protection of the free speech. So
I think that
you hinted at the difference between the attempt to protect privacy versus the protection of free speech.
Okay, so
This is our friend from Italy.
Yes. Okay. I'm making generalizations, but these are generalizations embodied in law. the Europeans are much more concerned with the firms. We have very few restrictions in this country. I mean, right now, all of us are just emitting all sorts of personal information. All of us. If you have any gadget on you, then you're constantly emitting information to companies that collect this information and use it for all sorts of reasons to make money, and hopefully to make your life better by bringing you things you want to see and excluding things you don't want to see. And we just don't care about that and what those firms do with it nearly as much as the Europeans. Now, I believe that a large part of that is just a difference in values. And the Europeans have always protected the individual vis-a-vis firms. They've emphasized that more for a long time. So that's just one area. And so when Facebook goes over there and collects all sorts of information, and then they pool it with their information in the United States, and then when the Europeans see that the National Security Agency might have an easier time getting at that information because Facebook's an American company, they worry about that. So that's one example. Now, a lot of people think, and I think there's an element of this, and that's true of the right to be forgotten, which First Amendment scholars in this country think is, Europeans regulate speech a lot more heavily. They regulate hate speech in a way, for example, Nazi speech and Nazi paraphernalia and the like can't be sold and can't be mentioned in certain ways. And the First Amendment would protect that speech in this country, and it's not protected there. Hate speech is much more heavily regulated. So that's another example. The right to be forgotten is something that wouldn't either be as attractive in this country. I'm not saying no one would like it, and it also might not be lawful if the government mandated it. So those are just different values that we have, and
Legal reasons.
they're legal. They're all legal reasons, but they're legal differences mostly embodied in values. A lot of people think they're valued in protectionism. They're grounded in protectionism. These are all ways, because all of these companies are American companies. The Europeans have not created functional equivalents to Google and Facebook and Twitter and a lot of other things. So a lot of people see this in part, these heavy regulations of U.S. companies, as just socking it to them if we don't like them and we want to try to engender or buck up some kind of local competition. I definitely think there's an element of that, and there's also an element of fear, frankly. I mean, I skipped over this quote, but this is Matthias Dopfner. He's the head of the largest publication conglomerate. I can't remember what the firm's called. And he wrote this famous open letter. If you want to get a sense for how the Europeans think of American technology firms, type in Matthias Dopfner letter Eric Schmidt. He wrote a famous open letter to Eric Schmidt about 4 years ago, in which he explained very candidly, and I thought very, not persuasively on the merits, but it really gave you the European position about why they don't like these companies. And they don't like them because they think they're monopolies that are controlling what their citizens are seeing through an American lens. So there's an element of that as well. So it's values, it's law, it's fear, and it's protectionism. I would say it's all of those things in some combination. Does that make sense?
Yes, it makes sense.
Yes, sir.
Insofar as the Europeans are much more comfortable regulating these firms, using real leverage to get the firms to change their internal policies to accord with European law, they seem much more comfortable doing those things than we are. Do they, from an infrastructure point of view or from a legal point of view, are they more prepared to make the kinds of reforms that you'd like to see us make here? Or are some of the legal and cultural differences there make them less prepared than
So
us?
that's actually a great question. That is a great question, and I don't know the answer. So you would think that since they're more inclined to regulate, that they should be more inclined to regulate to make these firms internalize the externalities related to cybersecurity. And so I would predict that, but just off the top of my head, I don't think that their liability regimes or regulatory regimes for cyber are as robust or any more robust than ours. So that's a great question, and it's kind of a puzzle within this framework, and I don't know the answer, but I'm going to figure it out in light of that question. That's a very good question. I don't know the answer. Anybody know the answer to that?
I was looking up Dopfner. What was the question again?
The question is, do the Europeans, tell me if I'm getting your question right, the Europeans quite clearly are less afraid of regulating internet technology firms, in part because they're not getting the huge benefits of innovation. They're getting at least they don't think that they are. I mean, their citizens do because Google has a 94% market share. But The question is whether, given their greater proclivity to regulate in this space, whether they have been less afraid about regulating in ways to internalize the externalities of poor cybersecurity. And you would think that they would be more inclined to do that, but I don't know if they have. I doubt that they have, or I probably would know about it. And so that's something worth figuring out. It's a very good question. I don't know the answer. Yeah.
Go back for a moment to the Cold War, Second World War lessons that we may or may not have learned in regard to security. Do you think that the military or the various aspects of defense in the government are taking this as seriously as we need to, which could open us up to attracting more divisions, one might say, whether it's people with life experience from even around the world to help us deal with this? And is it something that we just don't see because it's supposed to be secret, or is it really just not being taken seriously enough?
So the answer is the DoD. I can give you some examples. The DoD is a very big thing. It's it's the biggest corporation in the world, and it's got a lot of things going on. So starting about 7 or 8 years ago, it got much more serious about its cybersecurity, and it took a series of steps that have really raised the defenses of those networks from the outside world. A lot of easy things like decreasing the number of pipes through which the DoD network goes, so you can control those pipes and watch for bad actors, among other things. And having much more training about sticking things in USB drives and not even allow things to be stuck in USB drives. And a whole slew of things like that that have improved their cybersecurity. So yes. On the other hand, the National Security Agency, which is a division of the Department of Defense, has 4 or 5 times now had gigantic losses of some of their most significant offensive tools or information about their offensive tools, primarily, it seems, either through neglect or through insiders taking things out. And you would have thought after Snowden that they would have fixed that problem, and there is zero evidence that they have. And no head has rolled as far as I can tell about that. So I would, I think one can infer from that either, I don't think it's a problem that can be 100% fixed, but it doesn't seem like it's getting better. It seems like it's still very bad. So it seems not so serious there. On the offensive side, I don't know how to assess our offensive capabilities. Everyone says we have these amazing capabilities. My information about that is 13 years old and therefore very out of date. But I will tell you this, Ash Carter was former Secretary of Defense, who's at the Kennedy School now. He said in some forum that he was actually really disappointed, given all of our sophistication, what we were actually able to do with these tools in helping defeat ISIS. And I don't know what that means, but that's a pretty remarkable statement from the former Secretary of Defense. So that's a tableau of different pieces of DoD and different things they're doing well and not so well. And that's what I know. That's what I know.
So that's like a sort of a pre-9/11 mentality in this area?
I don't think it's not well,
I'm saying, are we about to have some kind of
I don't know.
9/11?
I don't know. I mean, Leon Panetta, Secretary of Defense, talked about a digital Pearl Harbor. People have been talking about that for 20 years. Richard Clark thinks it's going to happen. I just don't have the tools to assess it. And whether we're in a pre-9/11 mindset, we didn't know we were in a pre-9/11 mindset before 9/11.
Yeah, I'm sorry. That's what I meant the mindset part, not literally predicting it.
Yeah, but I don't know. We didn't know. I mean, pre-9/11, we thought we had the right balance of restraint and aggression in terms of dealing with problems. And I promise you, the Defense Department has been taking this very seriously, both on the offensive and the defensive side. There's so much going on. No time to talk about it. The Cyber Command has been stood up and reorganized and is in the process of being separated from the National Security Agency to separate exploitation from attack, and that's a controversial thing. They're doing all sorts of things that they think are going to put the country in a better posture. I mean, but in terms of defenses, some things have gotten better. The insider threat we have not found a way to deal with, and that's where we've been in terms of critical information lost. Chelsea Manning, Snowden, and the 3 or 4 things that have happened in the last 2 or 3 years from the NSA. This guy Martin, who walked out over years with just documents that he had in his house in his back seat, and these cyber breaches of offensive tools from the CIA and the NSA that we don't know quite yet how they happened. Some people think they're inadvertent. Some people think they're advertent. Disastrous, and it's hard, these things are easier to get out once they're digitalized. Martin takes out documents, but it's not hard to. There are massive auditing systems on these networks to try to follow when someone is doing something they shouldn't be doing, but it's not hard to download a hell of a lot of information on a little dot and take it and put it in your pocket and take it out of the building. And so it's a hard problem. I don't know where we are on the balance. I just can't tell. Yeah. Anna.
That there's a few retaliations in cybersecurity or on cyber attacks because of fear of effects on America itself. You treat this as though cybersecurity is one thing or cyber attacks are one thing, and then other foreign policy is kind of another thing. But with the two not possibly needed to, could it be that the fear of cyber attacks on this country are so great that it has influence on foreign policy, even in other aspects?
I think it's an element of our foreign policy. With the Chinese, it was the big sticking point in the middle of the Obama administration that the Chinese were stealing all this stuff from us. And it finally reached a crisis when Xi visited Obama in 2015. They supposedly reached this agreement. There was that agreement. I can go into detail if you want. It's not clear what happened there. There was a... You want to know about it?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so this is September of 2015, and since the beginning of the administration, and going back to the Bush administration, there have been complaints by government officials about Chinese government or Chinese firms under government control or with government support stealing our companies blind. Keith Alexander, the National Security Director at the time, said it was the greatest, how did he put it? Did I quote this in the paper? I think I did. The greatest theft in in world history or something like that. The greatest, something like that. And the numbers, who knows what the numbers were, but they clearly stole a lot of very valuable information, intellectual property and trade secrets that, companies would have a security breach, and then 6 months later, there would be a big factory in Shenzhen producing the things. And so they just leapfrogged their technical ignorance by stealing the stuff and putting it into action, which they're very good at. So, and we didn't sanction them, we didn't do anything, years and years, please stop it, wagging our finger. So finally we passed this executive order that said we're going to sanction you. There was a threat of sanctions, and Xi comes and they reach this agreement. And the agreement was that the Chinese, the norm was, and this was a norm the United States has always followed.
Which year now?
2015, September of 2015. And the norm we had always followed is we steal lots of stuff from foreign networks. And we also, we don't quite put it that way, and we also steal things from foreign corporations, but when they relate to a foreign policy or national security concern. But what we don't do is to steal from foreign companies and give that information to our firms for a commercial advantage. And there are a lot of reasons we don't do that. First of all, who would we give it to? Would we give it to Microsoft or Google? We can't do that, so we don't do it. And also, frankly, we are the intellectual property producers on average. Okay, so to a lot of people's surprise, there was a deal reached in September 2015 in which Xi, I wish I had the language with me, in which Xi and Obama agreed, it wasn't a treaty, it was a handshake, it was a diplomatic agreement, that both countries agreed that, this is almost exactly what it says, that the government will not intentionally or knowingly steal information from other networks with the intent of using it for a commercial purpose. Very vague, with the intent of using it for a commercial purpose. Okay, so that happens in 2015, and then over the next 2 years we hear reports that and who knows how to assess these, but that the Chinese theft diminished for the next 2 years by a significant amount, 50%, 80%, a lot. Now it's hard to tell, because if it's a Chinese firm stealing not at the behest of the government, then doesn't count. It's not a violation. And the government's relationship to its firms are very hard to assess. Also, what many people think happened when this diminution took place was that the only reason she reached this deal is that most of this stuff that was going on was corruption in the government. It was that, officials out in the intelligence agencies who are lining their pockets using these government tools, and that basically the United States helped Xi fix his agency problem and his corruption problem by bringing to his attention the fact that all this theft, and they showed him the evidence, and that Xi's on this anti-corruption kick, and so he was quite happy to get that evidence and to crack down on it, because they were stealing things kind of off government policy, okay? So that was the best explanation, people thought, for why this thing actually worked. But it hasn't gone to zero. It's gone down to 30 or 40%, and there's a lot of evidence that the government is still engaged in strategically stealing information that it believes should be used strategically for its firms. And this indictment that came down Monday is proof of that. It's just right in the teeth of the agreement, and we've got the evidence, and they have continued to do it. So I don't remember how we got on this, but that was the deal that was made. And how did we get on this? I forget now.
Well, my question was, you said America is afraid of retaliation in cyberspace, like a New York Stock Exchange bill or something like that. And my question was, does it influence regular foreign policy? Let's say.
So I'm sorry. So this was a big bone of contention in U.S.-China relations, and it was seen to have made it harder to reach agreements in other areas. And the agreement in 2015 was related to some agreements on climate change that were very important. So they're definitely connected. It's just a very important element of international relations. So it's one of the things that are being traded off. It's one of the things that are being negotiated over. It's one of the things that on the diplomatic table. And it permeates international relations. I mean, our relations with the Europeans, one of the biggest sticking points we have with them is this whole privacy shield thing, where they want to insist that that U.S. companies can't send data back to the United States because the NSA can get access to it. And that has had negative effects on our entire relationship. And it seeps into everything. So yes, they're very much related. Cyber and other elements of international relations are very much related. And in fact, our cyber relations are sometimes the most important problem. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Anybody talk about building a great, big, beautiful wall around the internet? Around what about cyber borders? I mean, to me, this is something. I worked for Oracle, and I saw Oracle intellectual property freely going to all of Oracle's worldwide subsidiaries, which was reasonably okay in the context of a multinational company. But there isn't any more protection if you're just a 200-person firm sitting in San Francisco or whatever. There's nothing there's no border guard checking a gigabyte of data going between us and China.
So you know who has this? China.
China has it.
The Great Firewall of China.
Yeah. Well, they also have walls all along the inside.
They have walls on the inside. They have a lot of people looking. They have AI. They have all sorts of things. So we can do that. And we can, and so one of the things I think I talk about in this paper, one big question on the table is, do we want to become more like China to have better cybersecurity?
But there's such a difference between blocking off Twitter from individuals and blocking off the exfiltration of intellectual property.
Yes, there is. I completely agree. But
I don't know how to tell the difference.
Yeah, but so here's one. Let me give you an example. So there's a government program called Einstein. And what Einstein does, this is a very simple cybersecurity tool. What Einstein does is, and I'm simplifying a great deal, it puts up a filter between government computers and the internet. And for every bad signature, malware signature, for every known signature of malware that the government knows about, it basically, all the traffic passes through that network, and you filter out the bad stuff. Now that's hard to do with encrypted communications, but you can do it with metadata, and so we do that with our government networks. And there's a debate about how effective it is, but it's a lot better than nothing. And we've extended that, and it gotten more and more sophisticated. We've extended that to our defense industry. It's called Defense Industrial Base, and we've extended Einstein to them. But what you just described, but just imagine the controversies that, okay, the government is going to filter everything coming in, and they're just going to take out the bad stuff. They're going to look at everything, some government computer, and just take out the bad stuff. That's a tough proposition. Now, when I said that the government's eventually going to be in the network, that's what I'm talking about.
No, but
That's what I'm talking about.
But when you talk about GDPRS, they're doing that without technology, but with legal force. And American companies are worried to death about the colossal fines if they happen to copy a private individual's information out of the EU into the United States.
Yeah.
I mean, that's all legal. That's not technology.
We can do it. There are many ways to do it. You can do it through legal filters or through computer filters. There are lots of different ways to do it. The problem is, do you want to give the government we wouldn't want, or we might not be able to have it. You're talking about the German law? Is that what you're talking about?
GDPRS is EU-wide.
Okay, I'm thinking about the German version of it that's even more aggressive.
Okay.
But we would have a hard time with a law like that, both morally and legally.
Mm-hmm.
And so there are lots of filters we could put up, but it comes at a cost. And we do look more like, I don't mean this, it looks to many people more like an authoritarian state because the government is in the business of looking at communications. Mm-hmm. The fundamental challenge here is that the same networks that are channels of attack are also channels of communication. And we definitely think the government should be stopping attacks, and we definitely don't think the government should be looking at people's speech in private. And teasing that out is the fundamental challenge. And maybe there will be some amazing technological way to do this. I don't know. That's the fundamental problem. You can do that through legal filters or computer filters or both in other ways as well.
Well, I think
we've come to the end.
Stop. Yes, and this has been wonderfully informative and disturbing.
Sorry. Thank you. Appreciate it. There are many other problems, and I'm happy to talk about anything you want on this topic. I hope this takes about 25 or 30 minutes. So, Hillary Clinton gave a speech in 2010 that was the most mature expression of the U.S. Open Internet or Internet freedom agenda. It didn't start with her. It actually started with her husband when he was president. But these ideas, most of them, had been articulated by the United States since 1990 as a way of thinking about what the U.S. position is on how we should think about the regulation of digital networks. And for current purposes, let's just think about that as the internet. So the United States was for the free flow of information across borders. It was against censorship. It was against blocking online services and taking down content. It was against burdensome Internet technology firm regulations. The Internet Freedom Initiative was something that Hillary Clinton started in the State Department in 2010, and the idea here is not only are we going to fight for these things at the rhetorical and diplomatic level, we're actually going to empower actors with tools abroad in authoritarian states to help them circumvent authoritarian control on their networks. So in China and Russia and nations in the Middle East, we're going to help civil society, help actors there who are fighting oppression, to try to empower them with tools to help them be anonymous when they're organizing, and to help them defeat censorship, and to help them avoid detection by the state. She said that to make all of this work, we have to have robust cybersecurity, and this was not an issue that was important in the 1990s when her husband was president, but it became very important to the United States by the 2000s because we were getting our cybersecurity was becoming a problem, primarily because we were having a lot of intellectual property theft, largely but not exclusively from the Chinese. But her general point was to have freedom on these networks, the networks have to be secure. For them to work, they have to be secure. And she proposed that the United States work hard to develop international norms, hopefully international law, to help ensconce or embody these principles. So that agenda, that vision is in tatters. It's just failed. And that's what this talk's going to be about. It's failed for three reasons. It's failed for a lot of reasons, but it's failed for three reasons I'm going to discuss. And these are the three reasons, and I'm just going to go through them. The first one I'm just going to spend one slide on. This is, if there's one thing that Americans don't understand that they need to understand about our cybersecurity predicament, and by cybersecurity predicament, that means, let me just tell you what I think that means. That means the fact that we can't protect our networks from theft or disruption, and disruption including things like the Democratic National Committee hack and the Russian disruption in the election last fall. So the entire array of theft and attack and disruption of digital networks. So the first thing and most important thing that Americans generally don't understand is that we, the United States, are seen as the great cyber bully when it comes to cyber intrusions. When Snowden revealed all that he revealed in 2013, he disclosed what people in the government knew, which is that the United States is completely inside the networks of other countries. And we're inside those networks, taking information and using it to advance our diplomatic and national security and economic, basically all of our international agenda is aided by these electronic surveillance abroad, sweeping up massive amounts of information. You can imagine other countries didn't like this very much. But it wasn't just that. It was two other things that form part of the tableau for why the United States is seen as a cyber bully, for lack of a better phrase. One was we were not just stealing information, but we were seen to be the ones that were engaged most in attacking networks. We were kind of bragging that we were very successful in attacking terrorist networks and helping to bring down terrorists. We were also, it was attributed to the United States, the Stuxnet attack in Iran in, I guess it was in 2009, 2010, around that period, started a little earlier. But this was, as General Hayden, who was the former director of the NSA and the CIA, said later, he said that Stuxnet crossed a Rubicon because it was the first time that there had been an attack by a major country on another major country that actually had physical consequences related to national security. And so we were the first to do that, and we were seen as the most aggressive. And frankly, the United States would brag about its offensive prowess in cyber. So the first thing you have to understand when we complain about things like all the terrible things the Chinese and the Russians are doing to us is nobody feels sorry for us because we're widely viewed as the biggest threat. That's background.
This is the program on constitutional government, and our guest today is Jack Goldsmith, professor of law at Harvard Law School. He's the Henry L. Shattuck Professor of Law, to be specific. He's written a book recently, most recently on the terror presidency, and there's a book coming out on Jimmy Hoffa that I heard about, and he's writing a book on the question of our topic today. He went to Washington and Lee College as an undergraduate, and then to Oxford, and then to Yale Law School, and he clerked with Justice Kennedy on the Supreme Court. He's also been outside of academia. He served in the Department of Justice, where he was Assistant Attorney General, Office of Legal Counsel from October 3 to 4, and then later on in the Defense Department, the Department of Defense, he served as special counsel to the General Counsel there. And he's taught at the Chicago Law School and Virginia Law School, and is now at Harvard. So his topic today is losing the internet freedom fight. So Jack.
Thank you very much, Harvey, for having me. Thanks for coming today. I'm at the beginning of writing a book about something related to the topic of today. And so I'm still trying to figure out what the book is about. I've got views and ideas, but I haven't formed a thesis yet. The basic thrust, and it's not at the 40,000 foot level, it's not very interesting, is that the United States is losing quite badly in both domestic and internationally in cybersecurity, in securing our digital networks. Digital networks in which all of our, or much of our economic and military and national security and diplomatic power lies, or at least is dependent. So today I'm going to walk you through some arguments that are basically drawn from the paper that you might or might not have read. That takes one lens on what the problems are. I don't think there's much in here that's normative. I'm just trying to explain. And the lens I'm going to use is the Internet Freedom Agenda, which has been, as I'll explain in a second, the U.S. agenda in terms of both domestically and globally for how the United States has thought about spreading its vision of the Internet and how it should be regulated. Anyway, I'm going to use that as a lens to get at some of the problems we face. The second point is that the openness that Clinton said she wanted to impose, and that the United States has been it has been an agenda item for the United States since the 1990s to help bring freedom to networks abroad. And I think and there was hope back in the 90s, and then there was hope in the 2000s, and then there was hope in the 2010s that this agenda was making progress, but I think we're now in a position to see that this has failed. The Chinese have much more control over their networks now than they've ever had, and they're getting better by the day at it. I'm not going to go through all of these techniques, but suffice it to say that through a variety of steps that they can take inside their borders, the Chinese have extraordinary control over their networks of any type that they want to exercise. But at the same time, it has not, as everyone predicted, meant that they don't have a robust and very vibrant internet. They do. If anyone's ever been on the internet in China, you see that there's a lot going on there, and it has been key to their economic success, and they have found ways to use digital networks to help bring economic success and also to have a robust social space, while at the same time doing an extraordinarily good job, effective I should say, job of maintaining the party's control and keeping out the kinds of speech and organization they want to keep out. And they basically have done this by all sorts of intermediary strategies, going after people and by going after institutions and networks and infrastructure and people inside their territory. They can achieve very effective control, and they have. And it's not just the Chinese. During the Arab Spring, early in the Arab Spring, there was a lot of hope that in those few months or maybe the year in which it looked like there might be a real revolution spreading around the Middle East. And it seemed that the organizations and the protests seemed to be enabled by social media. A lot of people at the time said, don't place too much faith in social media. It wasn't as consequential as you think, and it can be turned against those protesters. And in fact, that's what's happened. Basically, the state, what seemed like a change in technology that empowered the people against the state was really just the state being ignorant and not on top of the situation. Since the last 3 or 4 years, they have gotten on top of the situation. And they're regulating social media very, very heavily, and they're keeping out when they want, and they're using it, they're reverse engineering it to use it to monitor the people who are organizing and protesting. So as Ron Deibert says, and I think this is accurate, authoritarian regimes have proven themselves surprisingly and dismayingly light-footed and adaptable at controlling internet and social media and using these tools for their authoritarian ends. That's not the only thing. Tanks have been involved also. I don't want to say that it's all about social media one way or the other, but social media is not the threat, or at least it's a controllable threat, it seems. This is a Freedom House study from 2016. They just came out with another one, but I haven't studied it yet, about a week ago, but the results are basically the same. And they basically show that the yellow and the purple are places where there aren't what we would call freedom on the internet, especially the purple. And as the study shows, for the 6th year in a row these are soft variables that they use to study whether freedom has grown or declined, but by their numbers, and that's a pretty good test, freedom has been declining. States are getting more and more in the business of regulating intermediaries to control speech and political activity on the network. So that's what authoritarian states have been doing, and that's how they've been doing it to defeat our vision of the way the internet should work. The Europeans who have, of course, a different vision, closer to ours, but nonetheless quite different, have been imposing their vision on the network. And that vision is a vision that has a very different understanding of the relationship between the state and the individual. It's in some ways the opposite of ours. They value privacy, individual privacy. They value consumer protection and consumer control over their own information much more than they do free speech and digital trade, which is what we tend to value more. They have a much more robust conception of regulation. They're much more inclined to regulate these firms, and they're much more suspicious of government electronic surveillance than we are, primarily because, well, for a lot of reasons, and they especially don't like it when they think the United States is surveilling them heavily, which it does. That's why they were really angry by the Snowden stuff. So they've been in the business, and you read about this in the New York Times once every couple of weeks, of really regulating the hell out of our internet technology firms there in all of these dimensions. I don't think these are existential threats to these firms. These firms are extremely wealthy, and they're making a lot of money in Europe. The only point is that Europe has been able to impose its vision of the network within its borders, and it's not our internet freedom vision. And they do so through the same means that the Chinese and the Russians and the Saudis do, which is they control physical